Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome back to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight begins our peaceful journey through the medieval Crusader Kings, a remarkable collection of warrior monarchs who shaped the destiny of Europe and the Holy Land from the 12th to 13th centuries. In part 1, we'll softly explore the extraordinary reigns of Frederick Barbarossa and Baldwin IV, from the Holy Roman Emperor's mighty campaigns across Italy and his fateful journey to the east, to the courageous Leper King's valiant defense of Jerusalem against the legendary Saladin, all while the age of chivalry bloomed and the crusading spirit defined medieval Europe. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which medieval king's story resonates most with you, and subscribe to keep these soothing tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the high Middle Ages lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Frederick, later known as Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, entered this world during the middle of December in 1122 at Haguenau, located in what we now recognize as the Alsace region of eastern France. He received the simple name Frederick at his christening, while the epithet Barbarossa would come to him later due to his distinctive facial hair. Barbarossa translates to red beard in the Italian tongue. His father bore the title Frederick II, Duke of Swabia. This represented a vast duchy encompassing the territory roughly equivalent to southwestern Germany in our time, extending across the boundaries of France, Switzerland, and Austria. The Duke served as one of the principal leaders of the Hohenstaufen dynasty in Germany, a family line just beginning to assert major influence in European politics during the High Medieval period. His mother was Judith of Bavaria, daughter to Henry IX, the Bavarian Duke. She and Frederick Sr. had recently united in marriage, with Frederick Jr. representing their firstborn child. At some undetermined moment in the following years, possibly during 1123 or 1124, she delivered a second child, a daughter christened Bertha, though also called Judith. Nevertheless, the union yielded no additional children, and Judith departed this life prematurely in 1130. Consequently, young Frederick retained only dim recollections of his birth mother and would mature more familiar with his stepmother, Agnes of Saarbrücken, whom Frederick Sr. wed shortly following Judith's passing. To comprehend the sequence of events that would propel young Frederick to the forefront of European politics in the latter half of the 12th century, we must examine the frequently bewildering political terrain of Europe as it developed throughout the medieval ages. Following the centuries of upheaval that succeeded the Western Roman Empire's collapse in the 5th century AD, the Frankish king, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, managed during the 8th century's second half to construct a substantial empire, spanning most of present-day France, Switzerland, the Low Countries, much of Germany, and portions of Austria. Consequently, on Christmas Day in the year 800, he received coronation in Rome from Pope Leo III as the Holy Roman Emperor, with his territories designated as the Holy Roman Empire, a successor realm to the earlier Roman Empire, an action receiving formal church endorsement. This Holy Roman Empire, or Carolingian Empire, remained under Charlemagne's governance for several years, and though it passed intact to his son and heir Louis the Pious, when Louis perished in 840, the empire soon divided among his sons, and, subsequently, those sons partitioned their lands in turn, resulting in heavy fragmentation of both the Holy Roman Empire and Carolingian Empire by the 10th century. The Holy Roman Empire failed to survive in the western regions of Charlemagne's empire, where the French kingdom emerged as a distinct entity during the 10th century's course. However, it persisted in Germany and Italy, where the Holy Roman Emperor title transferred to various families after the direct Carolingian lineage expired in Germany in 888. Yet due to the rapid division and fragmentation of Carolingian territories throughout Germany and Italy in the 9th and 10th centuries, dozens of competing duchies and lordships existed throughout Germany when Frederick was born in the 12th century. Many rulers of these duchies possessed claims to the Holy Roman Emperor title. Should the male line of the Salian or Salic dynasty, which had served as Holy Roman Emperors since 1027, expire. When Frederick was born, the emperor was Henry V, who had been German king since 1099 and Holy Roman Emperor since 1111. His authority fluctuated throughout his reign, as many of Germany's more powerful dukes would frequently disregard his commands, while the sole other major area of the former Carolingian Empire, over which the Holy Roman Emperors still maintained nominal authority, was Italy. Yet here, the numerous cities and towns of the north were de facto independent by the early 12th century. Frederick's political life would concern itself with these two regions of Charlemagne's former empire. When Frederick was merely 3 years old in 1125, the Holy Roman Empire was thrust into chaos when Henry IV died without an heir. When this occurred, Frederick's father, the Duke of Swabia, was considered a leading candidate to succeed as German king and seek election as Holy Roman Emperor. The Hohenstaufens were indirectly descended from the Carolingians through several centuries, and the Duchy of Swabia was a stem duchy that had emerged in the 10th century following the complex fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. Furthermore, when Henry V had been compelled to journey south to Italy in one of his numerous conflicts with the papacy in Rome for control over Italian affairs, Frederick Sr. had often been appointed by the emperor to oversee German affairs during his absence. Indeed, it is believed that Henry desired Frederick to succeed him, but Frederick proved his own greatest obstacle in this regard. When the German lords and bishops assembled at Mainz city shortly after Henry's death to decide on a new emperor, Frederick alienated many with his overconfidence and reluctance to accept free princely elections. Consequently, a compromise candidate in the form of Lothair of Supplinburg was elected to succeed as Holy Roman Emperor. It was not an arrangement that would remain unchallenged for long. While all of this transpired, young Frederick was being prepared to become a lord one day. The education of those of noble birth in the 12th century focused on preparing sons to be battlefield commanders. He would have learned horseback riding from a very young age and combat with sword and other weapons. Armor would have been incorporated into this training after a certain point, as the manner in which 12th century medieval knights fought involved wearing heavy plate and chainmail armor. All of this came at the expense of what we would consider a normal education today. Many rulers had been illiterate in the early medieval period, and while this situation was improving by the 12th century, literacy was still not prioritized. There has been considerable debate regarding how well Frederick could read and write, and while we can probably dismiss earlier claims that he was illiterate, he was no scholar king either, and he had very little command of Latin, the language of scholarship, law, and the church in the high medieval period. Thus, Frederick was raised to rule on the battlefield, rather than from behind a desk. In 1137, when Frederick was approaching his late teenage years, the Holy Roman Empire's stability was once again questioned. That December, Lothair III died. He had only one surviving child, a daughter named Gertrude, and the succession was consequently thrown into fresh chaos. As a result, Frederick's uncle, Conrad, the Duke of Franconia, now moved to make himself German king and Holy Roman Emperor. Conrad had a long history of seeking the imperial crown. He had challenged Lothair's position back in 1127 and had been declared a rival emperor. And now the opportunity presented by the vacant imperial throne made him the obvious candidate. At a gathering of German princes and bishops at Koblenz in March 1138, he was elected emperor. However, he faced opposition himself from Henry the Proud, Duke of Bavaria and Saxony. This was the origin of a division within the Holy Roman Empire between the supporters of the House of Welf, of which Henry the Proud was the head, and the House of Hohenstaufen, from which Conrad and Frederick descended. Eventually, these two camps would become known as the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs is an Italian rendering of Welf, while Ghibellines is an Italianized form of Waiblingen, the name of the ancestral seat or stronghold of the House of Hohenstaufen in Württemberg, in Germany. The division between the Guelphs and Ghibellines would influence much of Frederick's later life. Conrad would rule as Holy Roman Emperor, albeit with some opposition from the House of Welf or Guelphs throughout the 1140s. Frederick's path, though, in these years, lay elsewhere. By the early 1140s, Frederick was emerging as a substantial character within Germany as he entered his adult years. He sat at several hoftages or imperial assemblies under his uncle's rule at various German cities between 1141 and 1145. By this time, the distinctive red beard for which he came to be known was visible. However, Frederick's destiny in the second half of the 1140s was not shaped by events in Germany or Italy, but by occurrences much further away. All the way back in 1095, Pope Urban II had preached of the need for a crusade or holy war to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity from the Muslims who had conquered the region. The First Crusade between 1096 and 1099 had been extremely successful, resulting in the establishment of several Crusader states around Jerusalem, Antioch, and other cities, including a newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem. However, in 1144, a Muslim ruler of the Middle East called Imad al-Din Zengi reconquered the city of Edessa from the Christians. This led a leading churchman, Bernard of Clairvaux, to preach on the need for a second crusade to be undertaken while he was visiting the city of Speyer in 1146. Frederick would soon be involved. Unlike the First Crusade, which was led by several leading nobles, but did not involve any of Europe's major monarchs, the Second Crusade was soon joined by the Holy Roman Emperor, Conrad III, and the King of France, Louis VII. Frederick took the cross himself, a symbolic gesture that indicated the intention to go on crusade, early in 1147, and committed himself to traveling with his uncle to the Holy Land. This was despite the objections of his father, the Duke of Swabia, who was dying and wanted his son and heir to remain in Germany to cement his control over the duchy when he passed away. In the event, Frederick Sr. died early in April 1147, and Frederick succeeded him before he ever left for the Holy Land. Thus, when Frederick led Swabia's contingent from the city of Regensburg in late May 1147 off towards the Holy Land, he did so as Duke of Swabia. They set off along with contingents of tens of thousands of other crusaders who departed from various places around Europe, some headed by sea from England, and won a notable victory before they ever left Europe by landing on the Iberian Peninsula and conquering Lisbon from the Muslims there for Portugal. Most, though, headed by land and by the late summer of 1147, were crossing through the Byzantine Empire, ready to make their descent on the Holy Land. The journey through the Byzantine Empire and then Turkey proved a pivotal episode in the Second Crusade. As they were passing through the empire's lands in the southeast of the Balkans towards the city of Constantinople, flash floods ravaged the Crusader camps in early September. Significant damage had been inflicted on Conrad and Frederick's forces. As a result of this, and this was compounded in the weeks that followed as they passed over the Bosphorus and into Anatolia in what is now western Turkey. For weeks in the autumn of 1147, the German armies were confronted by raids and ambushes on their forces by the Turks of the region. Eventually frustrated in their efforts, they sent messages ahead to the French under Louis VII to request his aid. The French subsequently joined up with the German Crusaders, but when Conrad himself fell sick, the combined forces retreated back to Constantinople. Consequently, it was a demoralized Crusader force that left Constantinople in ships acquired from Emperor Manuel I Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, having abandoned their plans to march overland. Thus, Frederick, Conrad, and their German Crusaders finally arrived in the Holy Land when they sailed into the port town of Acre on the 11th of April, 1148. This trip to the Holy Land had been an inauspicious beginning to the Second Crusade. It was compounded when they learned that King Louis's French forces, which had stubbornly maintained their overland march through Turkey, had been all but wiped out along the way. Louis had arrived in Antioch a few weeks earlier with the remains of his army, but they could now offer little to the military capabilities of the Second Crusade. Having learned this news, Conrad and Frederick proceeded from Acre to Jerusalem to visit the holy places and consult with the King of Jerusalem, King Baldwin III. A decision was taken at this juncture to hold a major council of the European kings and their lords, along with the lords and rulers of the Crusader state, at Acre in midsummer 1148. At the resulting Council of Acre, held at Palmyra, just outside the city on the 24th of June 1148, a decision was made to effectively change the goals of the Second Crusade. The crusade had been called for the purpose of reclaiming the city of Edessa from the Muslims, but now the loftier target of seizing Damascus, the capital of the Burid Emirate which ruled much of Syria at the time, was decided upon. This was a dangerous decision given that their forces were already much depleted from the losses they had suffered on their journey to the Holy Land. In the weeks that followed, the European monarchs, lords, and the heads of the Crusader states gathered their forces in preparation for the siege. Modern estimates of the combined forces which they advanced from Tiberias against Damascus in mid-July suggest a possible army of 50,000 men, but the likely number was probably considerably smaller. It is important to note that the bulk of the troops were comprised of recruits from the Crusader states themselves, rather than the European Crusader armies, which had been so depleted by the attempt to travel through Turkey. They arrived outside Damascus on the 23rd of July. What followed was a fiasco. Damascus was surrounded in the 12th century by vast orchards, which limited visibility on the approach to the city. And as they tried to near the walls, the Crusader forces faced constant hit-and-run attacks by the more mobile Burid cavalry. Over the next several days, tactical errors mounted on the part of the Crusaders, and a dispute broke out between rival contenders over who would rule Damascus if, by some miracle, they captured it. As a result, on the 28th of July, just 5 days after initiating the siege, Conrad and Frederick took their forces back towards Jerusalem, and the siege was abandoned. The disaster at Damascus did not immediately bring the Second Crusade to an end. Back at Jerusalem, plans were initiated to launch an attack on the smaller city of Ascalon, and Conrad and Frederick started off with their troops to head there, but quit the enterprise when it became clear that no coordinated response would come from the other Crusaders. With this, the Second Crusade was over, a costly and complete failure in terms of achieving its goals in the Holy Land. Although King Louis VII of France remained behind in Jerusalem until 1149, Conrad and Frederick made for Constantinople with what remained of their forces in late 1148. On the way to Thessaloniki in Greece, they reconfirmed an agreement which Conrad had reached with Emperor Manuel of Byzantium while in Constantinople the previous year. This was a deal whereby both sides would ally together to attack the Norman kingdom of Sicily, which ruled the island itself and much of the southern mainland of Italy. This was a part of Europe that would feature significantly in Frederick's own rule in the years to come. And with this agreement made, Frederick left Conrad and headed off in haste through the Balkans to Swabia, where he needed to shore up his own rule, having left so soon after he succeeded to the duchy in 1147. Back in Germany, Frederick set about consolidating his rule over Swabia. He might have remained a simple duke here for the next several decades, had it not been for events in the months that followed. In 1150, Henry Berengar, Conrad's eldest son, died. He had another child, also called Frederick, but this boy was just 5 years old at the time. Thus, Henry's death in 1150 opened the possibility of the succession descending elsewhere should Conrad die in the near future, and that is exactly what happened. In early 1152, Conrad, who was nearly 60, a ripe old age by the standards of the 12th century, fell ill. And when he died on the 15th of February, 1152 at Bamberg in Bavaria, there were just 2 individuals by his deathbed, the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, Eberhard II, and Frederick Barbarossa. We will never know if the tale Frederick and Eberhard emerged from the scene of Conrad's death with was true or not, but it would come to have enormous significance. Conrad, Frederick claimed, had chosen him to be his successor on his deathbed rather than his 6-year-old son. Whether it was true or not, the lords and electors of Germany wanted to believe it in order to avoid the chaos that would ensue from a long minority reign. Accordingly, Frederick was quickly designated as the next king of Germany and crowned as King of the Romans at Aachen on the 9th of March 1152. This effectively made him the Holy Roman Emperor. However, he would have to wait some time for the formal coronation. Frederick quickly made clear his intention to revitalize the Holy Roman Empire and the position of the emperors. For decades, the imperial title had been weakening. In Germany, there were over 1,000 separate political entities, all of which were nominally under the overall rule of the emperor, but which in reality generally paid little more than token recognition to the emperors. Some amongst the Guelphs were openly hostile to the Ghibelline emperors, such as Conrad had been, and Frederick now was. In Italy, the other major area where the Holy Roman Empire still held some sway, Frederick would face opposition from Roger II of Sicily, whose powerful Norman kingdom in the south of Italy could conduct raids further north with impunity. More significantly, the emperors had been weakened in their authority as a result of what was known as the investiture controversy in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. This was a dispute which had arisen between the papacy and the emperors over whether Rome or the current emperor had the right to appoint bishops and archbishops in Germany and Italy. The papacy had won the argument, but it had created a rift between Rome and the emperors. As a result, Conrad had never actually been crowned in Rome as Holy Roman Emperor, and the many cities and towns of northern and central Italy had begun to exercise increasing independence, so that by the time Frederick became emperor in 1152, imperial control over the Kingdom of Italy had diminished almost entirely. All of these issues confronted Frederick when he became emperor in 1152, but he quickly took steps to strengthen his position. Just months later, in 1153, he reached an agreement with Pope Eugenius III known as the Treaty of Constance. Under the terms of this, Frederick promised to help prevent any efforts by the Byzantine Empire to re-establish itself in Italy, and also to help Eugenius to gain control of Rome again. The Pope had spent much of his pontificate since 1145 at Farfa Abbey north of the Eternal City, as Rome itself had been taken over by a body of citizens led by Arnold of Brescia, a religious radical who established the Commune of Rome as a patrician government. In return, Frederick affirmed his claim to become the emperor and was attempting to indicate that he did not need papal approval in order to become the legitimate Holy Roman Emperor. Moreover, he was further facilitated in the months that followed by the death of Roger II of Sicily. He was succeeded by his son William, who was not necessarily an ineffective ruler, but was not the equal of his father, who had been one of the most dynamic and energetic rulers of 12th century Europe. Once the Treaty of Constance had been agreed, Frederick began preparing his forces for a campaign into Italy. His actions in the peninsula and how they related to his control over Germany and relationships with successive popes would come to dominate Barbarossa's reign. The country at this time was a patchwork of different political entities, which was almost as confusing as 12th century Germany's political landscape. In the south, the Kingdom of Sicily, which covered the island itself and much of the peninsula, south of Rome, was the dominant power. Elsewhere, a number of states, such as the Republic of Venice in the northeast of the country, were also independent, but much of central Italy and the north in the plain of Lombardy was nominally part of the Kingdom of Italy. This was another constituent part of what had been the Carolingian Empire hundreds of years earlier, but which had also fragmented as Germany had. Thus, it included cities such as Rome, Milan, Mantua, Bologna, Florence, Genoa, and Turin, which theoretically owed some allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, but which, as we have seen, were independent in all but name by the mid-12th century, and were governed as city-states by their own communes of wealthier citizens. Now, shortly after ascending as emperor, Frederick's mission was to re-establish imperial authority across the peninsula. Frederick began reasserting himself in Italy with an intended campaign against the Normans in the south in the autumn of 1154. With Roger II just having died and the country adjusting to a new ruler, Barbarossa believed this was the time to strike the powerful Kingdom of Sicily. However, no sooner had he arrived in the plain of Lombardy with a field army of about 7,000 men, including 1,800 knights, than he realized exactly how unwilling to obey his commands the cities of the Kingdom of Italy were. Consequently, he immediately changed tactics and instead began a military campaign against the northern cities, forcing Milan to submit to him that winter and completely destroying the town of Tortona in the Piedmont in northwestern Italy. Then he proceeded towards the city of Pavia, from where the Holy Roman Emperors had long based their rule in the Kingdom of Italy to avoid jurisdictional overlaps with the papacy in Rome. Here, Frederick was formally crowned as King of Italy on the 24th of April, 1155. With this done, he campaigned further south through Florence and Bologna, all the time making it clear that he intended to exercise greater control over the Italian cities than they had seen from a Holy Roman Emperor. In some time, with his control over the north of Italy reimposed, Frederick continued south to fulfill his promises to Pope Adrian as part of the Treaty of Constance. Thus, in early June, he arrived in Rome, where he had Arnold of Brescia, the religious radical leader there, executed. Then Pope Adrian entered the city and formally crowned Barbarossa as the Holy Roman Emperor on the 18th of June 1155, even as riots were occurring across the city in opposition to the reimposition of imperial and papal rule. In the hours that followed, Frederick's troops restored order to the city, but by that time there were over 1,000 Romans dead on the streets as a result of the unrest. And thereafter, Frederick proceeded south with the goal of finally campaigning against the Normans. Yet reinforcements which he had been promised by the German lords never arrived. Consequently, he returned to Germany late in 1155, bringing his first Italian campaign to an end. His goal was now to strengthen his position in Germany before attempting a second campaign in Italy. This he duly achieved by placating the leading lord of the Welfs, or Guelphs in Germany, Henry the Lion, by granting him the Duchy of Bavaria in 1156. This made Henry the second most powerful lord in Germany, next to Barbarossa himself. But in doing so, Frederick galvanized the support of the German lords in advance of a new campaign into Italy. It was also in 1156 that Frederick entered into his second and more substantial marriage. Barbarossa had married much earlier, in 1147, prior to his departure from Germany on the Second Crusade, to Adelaide of Wolburg, a daughter of the Bavarian Margrave, Diepold III of Wolburg. But the union proved unsatisfactory. It did not lead to children, and Adelaide was suspected of adultery during Frederick's absence in the Holy Land. Accordingly, an annulment was secured in 1153. Then, 3 years later, Frederick married Beatrice of Burgundy, the only surviving child of Renaud III, the Count of Burgundy, as his second wife. As a result, Frederick became co-ruler of the County of Burgundy, an acquisition which provided him with lands strategically located north of the plain of Lombardy in northern Italy. These could now be used as a way to campaign into Italy without having to rely exclusively on bringing his forces over the Alps through the Brenner Pass. The marriage proved happy by the standards of the time, and after several years, it also resulted in 11 children between 1162 and 1179. 8 of these were boys, so there would be no question of Frederick not having a surviving heir when he died. With his position in Germany at least temporarily strengthened, and having acquired the further boon of control over Burgundy through his marriage, Frederick undertook his second Italian campaign in the summer of 1158 with the goal of further consolidating his hold on the Kingdom of Italy and then invading the Kingdom of Sicily. This time, he was accompanied by Henry the Lion and enjoyed much greater support from the German lords as a consequence. As a result, when they descended into the plain of Lombardy that summer, Barbarossa's forces quickly crushed a fresh bout of unrest in the city of Milan, the leading city in the north of Italy. Following this, an imperial diet or parliament was convened at Roncaglia near Piacenza. Here, Frederick made it clear that he intended to re-establish imperial authority across Italy, and further efforts to acquire independence by cities such as Milan would only result in fresh military campaigns by him. The warning was not heeded, however, and rebellions sprung up across the north of Italy in the months that followed, notably at the city of Crema, where Frederick spent much of the rest of his second Italian campaign engaged in a siege in 1159. It was while Frederick was engaged in the siege of Crema in 1159 that Pope Adrian IV died. This would have major consequences for the next 20 years of Italian politics, as at a papal conclave which followed, the favoured candidate amongst the cardinals was unquestionably Roland of Siena, a cardinal and the papal chancellor. But there was a problem with this proposed candidate. Roland was an avowed opponent of Frederick's, who had consistently argued throughout the 1150s that the Holy Roman Emperor was a vassal of the papacy and took his commands from Rome, not the other way around as Barbarossa wanted it. Therefore, when the papal conclave elected Roland and he became Pope Alexander III, Frederick moved to have his closest rival, a Ghibelline candidate, Octavian of Monticelli, elected. Octavian was duly elected by a minority of the cardinals and became Pope Victor IV. Victor was the first of 3 so-called anti-popes, the others being Paschal III from 1164 and Calixtus III from 1168. These were popes who were not legally elected by a majority of cardinals, but who were set up by Frederick as rivals to Alexander III during his long pontificate down to 1181. Thus, Frederick effectively shattered the harmony of the church in Italy for 22 years following Alexander's election as pope, as a means of keeping this opponent of imperial authority from having full control over the papacy. The immediate consequences were that Pope Alexander now moved to ally the papacy with the Kingdom of Sicily against any further incursions by Frederick against Rome or the south of the Italian peninsula. They also began fomenting further unrest in the north, and this was at least partially responsible for a new revolt by Milan in the early 1160s. A lengthy siege followed in 1161 and early 1162, following which the Milanese finally surrendered on the 6th of March 1162. Unhappy at having become bogged down in northern Italy for nearly 4 years, when his goal all along had been to strike against the Kingdom of Sicily, Frederick exerted a heavy revenge on Milan for having revolted 3 times under his rule already. When the city was entered in early March, his army set about destroying much of it in the hours that followed. The example this set led several other cities across the north, such as Brescia and Placentia, which had also revolted, to surrender, actions which brought to an end Barbarossa's second Italian campaign. Thereafter, he briefly returned to Germany, but it would not be long before fresh unrest arose to the south. It was not all war for Frederick. His reign was also central to what is known as the 12th century Renaissance. This was an early period of political, social, cultural, and intellectual revival throughout Europe following the Dark Ages, which had followed the fall of the Roman Empire. This early Renaissance saw many marked advancements in these fields, which are now seen as being necessary precursors to the later, more well-known Italian Renaissance of the 15th century, which spread throughout Europe during the 16th century. One of the foremost elements of this earlier 12th century Renaissance was the emergence of Europe's first universities. These typically emerged where groups of students pooled their financial resources together to hire scholars to teach them. The first such university to emerge anywhere in Europe was in the Italian city of Bologna. Some studies place the foundation date to 1088, but what is generally agreed is that the university here was given a formal foundation in 1158, when, at the beginning of his second Italian campaign, Frederick issued what is known as the Authentica Habita, a document which set out for the first time what the rights and responsibilities of both the students and teachers at the University of Bologna were. This was a highly important formalization of the university here, and in the early 13th century, the model provided by Bologna was imitated by the universities of Oxford and Cambridge in England, Paris in France, Salamanca in Spain, and Padua in Italy. Another element of this 12th century Renaissance, which was characteristic of Frederick's reign, was the revival and interest in different forms of legal systems. During the medieval period, the legal systems of kingdoms such as England and France, and other entities such as the Holy Roman Empire, had come to increasingly be a combination of canon law, or church law, and common law, which was effectively a distillation of earlier Germanic laws and Roman civil law. However, during Frederick's reign, there was renewed interest in different legal systems, with an increasing number of lawyers being hired by governments, such as Frederick's. Thus, there was a revival of interest in Roman civil law at Frederick's court, and also alternative legal systems, such as the Justinian Code, a legal code which had been developed by the early 6th century Byzantine Emperor Justinian. Much of this revival was purely motivated by self-interest on Frederick's part, as he sought to use legal arguments to justify his attempts to have greater jurisdiction than the papacy in Rome over parts of Italy. But it is significant that it was revived as a result of Frederick's reign, and the Roman civil law went on to fundamentally influence the legal systems of modern Europe in due course. It is interesting to speculate, given these administrative and educational reforms, how Barbarossa's reign might have developed had he not engaged in determined efforts throughout it to re-establish imperial control over Italy. But ultimately, his attentions were focused on the southern peninsula. No sooner had he returned to Germany in 1162 after his second Italian campaign, than he was planning a third for 1163, this one again aimed at finally campaigning against William I of Sicily in the south. However, the third Italian campaign would, yet again, be diverted following the emergence of a new independence movement in the urban communes at Verona and neighboring cities in the northeast. This time, Frederick was unable to suppress these in the same way that he had the revolt of the early 1060s by making an example of Milan. This is because the insurrection was more coordinated, with the cities of Verona, Padua, and Vicenza allying themselves into what was known as the Veronese League, which also acquired the aid of the independent and powerful Republic of Venice. As a result, Frederick was unable to tame them immediately following his entry into Italy in 1163, and instead cut the third Italian campaign short. He returned to Germany and began preparing a fourth larger expedition, the Fourth Italian Campaign, which Frederick led south through the Brenner Pass and into Italy in 1166, was a more formidable affair than the third campaign a few years earlier. This time, Barbarossa had a different approach. Rather than striking at the cities of the Veronese League and other recalcitrant elements amongst the cities of the plain of Lombardy, he would pass through the north entirely and move against Rome. And Pope Alexander III, whom he believed was the major prop holding together the rebellious cities in the north. Frederick was also doubtlessly perturbed by rumors that the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I, had sent emissaries to Alexander offering to end the Great Schism, which had developed between the Roman Catholic Church in the west and the Greek Orthodox Church in the east over several significant doctrinal and procedural differences between the two churches. If the Pope would recognize Manuel's rights to land, which had previously belonged to the Roman Empire in Italy and elsewhere, if Alexander was so inclined, then Manuel would send aid to Italy to help the Pope in his struggle with Frederick. Thus, Barbarossa had more reasons than one to strike against the papacy in 1166. The Fourth Italian campaign, like the Third campaign a few years earlier, ran into stalemate. Frederick proceeded south and captured Rome after victory outside the city at the Battle of Monteporzio on the 29th of May, 1167. Alexander now fled south to the Kingdom of Sicily and found refuge at the city of Benevento, while Frederick imposed the anti-Pope Paschal III in Rome. However, this victory soon turned to despair. Disease struck Frederick's forces in Rome, most likely an outbreak of malaria, severely reducing his military capacity. Then news arrived from the north that while he was capturing Rome, the Veronese League had expanded to include nearly every city and town in the plain of Lombardy, including Milan, Genoa, Bologna, Crema, Cremona, Mantua, Piacenza, Brescia, Modena, Parma, and Ferrara. Leading members of the communes of these cities and towns had sworn an oath at the Abbey of Pontida, near Bergamo by the Italian Alps on the 7th of April 1167, creating this new Lombard League. As new members joined every week, and with his own forces ravaged by the outbreak of malaria in Rome, Frederick now decided to postpone his showdown with the Italian cities and return to Germany in 1168. It would be 6 years before he returned for the final showdown. Frederick spent the late 1160s and the early 1170s undertaking reforms elsewhere to strengthen his position in advance of a new campaign into Italy. For instance, economic changes of a kind were made, particularly in the proliferation of mints throughout Central Europe to produce imperial coins. There were just 24 of these in all of Germany at the start of his reign in the early 1150s, but by the 1180s, well over 100 could be found in the same region. He also made efforts to strengthen imperial authority to the east of the Holy Roman Empire, around Bohemia and Hungary, two regions which had been expanding in the 12th century into the Balkans and western Poland. For instance, when a dispute arose in the Kingdom of Bohemia over the succession there in the early 1170s, Barbarossa convened a diet at the German town of Hermsdorf in September 1173, where he championed the cause of Aldrich, a son of the former king, Soboslav. Admittedly, Aldrich did not want the crown and immediately abdicated in favor of his brother, Soboslav, who then became Soboslav II, a decision which temporarily seemed to stabilize the situation in Bohemia, although fresh unrest arose in the mid-1170s. By the time that the latter unrest arose in Bohemia, Frederick had already turned his attentions back southwards towards Italy. In 1174, he undertook his Fifth Italian campaign, the last major military foray into the peninsula of his reign. For this, he brought an army of over 10,000 troops south from Germany. However, he faced an unprecedented alliance of the Lombards, League, the papacy, and the Kingdom of Sicily, with some minor support provided by the Byzantine Empire. At first, it seemed possible that direct conflict could be avoided as negotiations were opened between Barbarossa and the Lombard League at the city of Pavia, but these broke down in the summer of 1175. Months of movements across the plain of Lombardy followed as the League was able to gather an army of in excess of 20,000 men, while Frederick sent missives north to Burgundy and various parts of Germany requesting further detachments to be sent south. The reinforcements he received did not meet his expectations, and when the Imperial and League forces finally clashed at the Battle of Legnano on the 29th of May, 1176, to the northwest of Milan, Frederick suffered the worst military defeat of his life. The emperor was struck from his horse during the conflict and wounded, to the extent that it was briefly believed he was dead. Frederick's defeat at the Battle of Legnano was the turning point in the Italian wars he had engaged in for 20 years. He now accepted that he would have to reach an agreement with the communes and nobles of the northern cities. He realized that he could not overwhelm them and force them into complete submission as he had set out to do 20 years earlier. But, at the same time, the Italian communes of the north knew that they would have to acknowledge some imperial oversight of northern Italy, and they could not go back to the de facto independence they had held for much of the first half of the 12th century. Accordingly, negotiations were entered into between Frederick and the League, with Alexander III sending emissaries from Rome. The result was the Treaty of Venice, which was agreed to at the Trading Republic city on the 22nd of July 1177. The treaty did not bring about a full resolution to the showdown between the Italian cities and Frederick, but largely concluded that a 6-year truce would hold between the Emperor and the League. In the meantime, negotiations for a fuller, more long-lasting understanding would continue. The Treaty of Venice brought to an end Frederick's military campaigning in Italy, but while he had technically lost the war with the defeat at Legnano, in the end, he gained a partial victory in the peace. When the 6-year truce concluded, it was replaced by a new diplomatic arrangement, which was signed at Lake Constance on the 25th of June 1183. The Peace of Constance was a major compromise. The cities and towns of the Kingdom of Italy would henceforth be allowed to manage much of their internal affairs themselves, but they agreed to acknowledge Frederick's imperial claims on northern and much of central Italy. They would owe fealty to Frederick, who would have the right of appointment of some of the senior officials in each city. Office holders throughout the communes would also have to swear an oath of fealty to the emperor, and while the court systems would operate independently in each city or town, citizens there could appeal to the imperial court in Germany if they so wished. Thus, the Peace of Constance guaranteed the Italian cities a substantial degree of internal independence, but Frederick, after nearly 30 years of conflict in Italy, had succeeded in re-establishing a much greater degree of control over the region than many of his near predecessors as emperor had enjoyed. With the wars over in Italy, Frederick was able to turn his attention yet again to Germany, where he sought revenge against those who had failed to adequately reinforce him in 1175 and 1176 before the defeat at Legnano. In particular, he was determined to move against Henry the Lion, the Welf or Guelph leader, to whom he had granted the Duchy of Bavaria back in 1156. In order to quell unrest amongst the Welf faction at that time, Henry had failed to support his Fifth Italian campaign adequately and had also aroused some enmity within Germany at his accumulation of huge tracts of land. As a result, Frederick was able to place Henry on trial in 1180 on the grounds that imperial law held sway over traditional German law, and that Henry could be tried on charges brought by an emperor. Henry refused to appear at the trial and was quickly found guilty in absentia. Frederick then invaded his lands in Saxony, and Henry was eventually forced to submit in November 1181. Shortly afterwards, he was driven into exile for 3 years, which he spent in northern France. Thereafter, he returned to Germany and tried to re-establish himself, but he never regained the authority he had held prior to 1180. Moreover, with the death of Pope Alexander III in August 1181, Frederick found another adversary gone from the scene. If an indication of Frederick's position as the strongest Holy Roman Emperor which Europe had seen for some time were needed, then one was provided in May 1184, when Barbarossa summoned an imperial diet to assemble at the city of Mainz in western Germany on Pentecost. The Diet of Pentecost, as it has become known, saw the great lords of the empire assemble by the river Main there from the 20th of May onwards. Several banquets and ceremonies were held, and there was talk of developing an anti-French alliance with England by the German lords to re-extend imperial control over eastern France. The Diet was widely written about at the time and celebrated for its indication of how Barbarossa had rejuvenated the empire, and a further victory soon followed. In 1186, Frederick managed, despite papal objections, to engineer the marriage of his son, Henry, to Constance of Sicily, a posthumously born daughter of King Roger II of Sicily. This opened the possibility of the Hohenstaufens one day having a claim to the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily, a possibility which, if realized, would see the family and Ghibelline influence extend from Sicily north to the Baltic Sea. And so, the victories which had so often escaped Frederick on the battlefield were accumulating through diplomacy in the 1180s. It was, though, the call of the battlefield which still appealed to Frederick. In 1187, just after he had organized the Sicilian marriage, that call came yet again from the east. The Crusader states were in fresh trouble there. A dynastic crisis had broken out in the Kingdom of Jerusalem following the death of King Baldwin IV in 1185. The problem was compounded by the fact that the disparate Muslim kingdoms of Syria and Egypt, which were often divided amongst themselves, had been united under a new Muslim leader from Kurdistan. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he is better known as Saladin, meaning the goodness or righteousness of the faith. In July 1187, his forces won a great victory at the Battle of Hattin near the city of Tiberias against a Crusader army where over 10,000 Christian soldiers are believed to have lost their lives or been captured. With the fighting forces decimated, the Crusaders were unable to prevent Saladin from continuing onwards to Jerusalem and recapturing the city after nearly a century in Christian hands. The call now went out from the remaining Crusader states. Help was needed from Europe if they were to survive and retake Jerusalem, and when word reached 67-year-old Frederick Barbarossa, he determined to take the cross again and return to the Holy Land 40 years after his last foray there. Preparations commenced in April 1188 and were to continue throughout the empire for the next year. Frederick would be joined by several senior lords, the most notable being Richard the Lionheart, a prince of England who would soon become its king following King Henry II of England's death in the summer of 1189. King Philip II of France also took the cross, as did several of Frederick's senior lords, such as his son, the Duke of Swabia, Frederick VI, and Leopold V of Austria, with Europe's three most powerful states, England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, in support of it. The Third Crusade was formidable. Barbarossa's contingent alone would constitute upwards of 15,000 soldiers, at least 3,000 of which were knights. Beyond these military preparations, diplomatic envoys were also sent out to the various powers in the Balkans and even the Seljuk Turks of the region around modern-day Turkey, with the goal of securing safe routeways to the Holy Land from Europe. There could be no repeat of the arduous journey from Constantinople to Jerusalem during the Second Crusade, where the Crusaders had been massively depleted before they ever arrived to Acre and Antioch. With all of this in place, Frederick took the staff of a pilgrim at his birthplace of Haguenau on the 15th of April 1189 and set out for the Holy Land. Despite the Crusaders' best efforts to ensure a safer passage this time, Frederick would never make it to the Holy Land. The journey through the Balkans and the Byzantine Empire into Anatolia was relatively smooth, though slow. By the summer of 1190, they were in southern Turkey, making their way along the coast towards Mersin, after which they would soon turn south towards Jerusalem. When a shortcut was proposed to Frederick along the Salif River, he took the advice offered to him, but it was a fatal mistake. There are varying accounts of exactly what happened, but all are clear that Frederick drowned in the Salif River near Salifka Castle on the 10th of June 1190. Some suggest that he was weighed down by his armor after falling from his horse, while others believe he tried to traverse the river. What is clear is that he died, and once he did, much of the German contingent melted away and returned to Europe. Thus, it was a much reduced force that his son Frederick led on to the Holy Land, where they variously buried his bones and flesh. In Antioch and Tyre, there, they joined up with the other Crusaders who had arrived by sea. Over the next 2 years, they would fight Saladin to a stalemate, never recovering Jerusalem, but forcing the Muslim lord to allow safe passage of Christians to the city. The Holy Roman Empire was weakened in the long run by Frederick's death. He had rejuvenated it and made it strong again after decades of internal strife and political decline during the first half of the 12th century. His eldest surviving son, Henry, succeeded him as Holy Roman Emperor in 1191, following the receipt of news that Barbarossa had died on the way to the Holy Land. Henry VI, as he became, was an effective emperor who built on his father's successes. In 1194, he claimed the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily by right of his marriage to Constance in 1186, and thereafter he even went to war against the Byzantine Empire and extracted a vassalage tax from Constantinople. But Henry died prematurely, possibly of malaria, in September 1197, and this development opened up a period of renewed conflict within the empire. Philip of Swabia, another of Barbarossa's sons, was elected as Holy Roman Emperor in 1198, but a rival contender emerged from the Welf faction in the shape of Otto of Brunswick. Accordingly, for the next 11 years, There were two rival emperors before Philip's death saw Otto become the only unchallenged Welf or Guelph emperor of the High Middle Ages. Henry VI's son, named Frederick after his grandfather, managed to reacquire the imperial title in 1215 and created a strong, centralized state, much like Barbarossa had 40 years earlier. But his death in 1250 ushered in a renewed period of decline. Thereafter, the Kingdom of Sicily passed to the French House of Anjou in 1266, and imperial authority in Italy slowly collapsed in the late 13th century as fully independent republics began to emerge in Milan, Florence, Genoa, and other cities. Frederick Barbarossa, of course, has had a modern-day afterlife. When the forces of Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they did so following the plans laid down in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. This blueprint for the conquest of Eastern Europe was variously named Operation Otto and Operation Fritz during the planning stage. However, in the months before the invasion was undertaken, it was renamed Operation Barbarossa at the directive of Adolf Hitler. Hitler seems to have wished to use the name for two reasons. Firstly, he believed that it was fitting because Barbarossa had sought to establish a militarily and administratively strong German empire during the 12th century, after the Holy Roman Empire had been weakened for several decades, similar to how Germany had been weakened through its defeat in the First World War. Secondly, the Nazis believed Barbarossa had an acute interest in expanding Germany eastwards. But while Christian Europe was certainly expanding into the Baltic Sea region and further east during the 12th century, it was a complete misconception to believe that Frederick Barbarossa had been at the forefront of this eastward march. Rather, as the foregoing has demonstrated, his primary concern was always with Germany and Italy and the rejuvenation of imperial power there. Frederick Barbarossa is a paradoxical figure and one whose career can be difficult to assess given the sheer complexity of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany and Italy during the 12th century. A casual observer could conclude that his reign was not very successful at all. For instance, his near 40-year term as emperor was bookended on either side by the Second Crusade in the late 1140s and the Third Crusade in the late 1180s. The first of these was a failure when judged by any criteria and achieved nothing in the Holy Land other than a failed siege of Damascus, which lasted less than a week. The Third Crusade was much more successful overall, but Frederick never made it to the Holy Land himself. At home, he was often even less successful. The paramount concern of his reign was to re-establish imperial control over the Kingdom of Italy, and he launched 5 campaigns into the plain of Lombardy between the mid-1150s and the mid-1170s to try to achieve that. Eventually, at the end of these, he was effectively defeated by the Lombard League at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. His loftier earlier ambition to conquer the Kingdom of Sicily was never really attempted, because his attention was always on the north of Italy. However, to assess Frederick Barbarossa's career in this way would be to overlook his accomplishments. When he effectively became Holy Roman Emperor in 1152, following his election as King of Germany, the empire had been weakened by decades of decline. Germany was divided between the Welfs and Hohenstaufen factions, or Guelphs and Ghibellines, as they have more popularly become known, and imperial control over the Kingdom of Italy had all but vanished in the wake of the investiture controversy and the clash with the Pope. As a result, the many cities and towns of northern and central Italy were all but independent city-states ruled by their own communes. Frederick changed all of that. By reaching an accommodation with many of the Welf lords in Germany, he galvanized imperial control over the country. By engaging in a relentless campaign to wear the Italian cities down between the 1150s and the 1170s, he re-established a degree of imperial rule over the Kingdom of Italy under the terms of the Peace of Constance in 1183. Near the end of his life, he also ensured that his son would become the King of Sicily by marrying Henry to Constance. However, there was one major flaw in all of this. While Frederick was able to revive imperial power in Germany and Italy during his reign, the settlement he reached in both countries relied on strong imperial rule for it to be maintained. When weaker rulers came along after himself and his grandson, Frederick II, ultimately the process of political fragmentation in Germany and Italy and the decline of imperial rule recommenced. King Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem Baldwin, later known as King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, entered this world at some point during the early summer of 1161. The precise date of his birth remains unknown, nor is the location certain, though it is commonly assumed to have been in the city of Jerusalem. His father was Amalric, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon. As Count, he ranked among the foremost lords of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, hardly surprising, given that he belonged to the royal family and his brother was King Baldwin III of Jerusalem. The young Baldwin received his name in honor of his uncle, the king, who also served as godfather for the newborn when he was baptized in 1161. Baldwin, though, would never come to know the monarch for whom he was named. In February 1163, Baldwin III died, most likely from complications arising from dysentery, though suspicions emerged that he was poisoned. Childless at just 33 years of age, his death paved the way for his brother Amalric to succeed as King of Jerusalem. With this, Baldwin, who was still approaching his second birthday, became the heir to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin's mother was Agnes of Courtenay, a scion of the House of Courtenay, which had branches back in Western Europe and in the Holy Land, her father Jocelyn having been Count of Edessa. She was also closely related to the royal line of Jerusalem. She and Amalric had one other child beyond Baldwin, a daughter named Sibylla, who was born either in 1158 or 1159, and so was Baldwin's older sister. Sibylla would play a major role in Baldwin's life. His mother, though, would never be Queen of Jerusalem. At the time of the death of Baldwin III in the spring of 1163, as Amalric was preparing to succeed his brother, the religious authorities of Jerusalem and other bishoprics of the Crusader states had objected to Agnes becoming queen, claiming that she and Amalric were too closely related for their marriage. Back in 1157, to have been given church approval. The pair were only related in the fourth degree, a hardly unusual circumstance in the marriage of royals and nobles in medieval times, and so the objection to Agnes becoming queen must have been the result of some unclear political intrigue. Whatever the precise reasons were, Amalric caved to the church's demands. He declared his marriage to Agnes void and became king, remarrying in 1167 to Maria Komnene, a grandniece of the Byzantine emperor Manuel III. This second marriage would result in just one daughter, and so Baldwin remained the undisputed heir to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, even though he had been forced to renounce her in 1163, Agnes remained a powerful figure at the royal court in Jerusalem throughout the 1160s, 1170s, and early 1180s during Baldwin's later reign. Baldwin was born in the Crusader states of the Holy Land. These had only existed for just over a half a century. Back in the early days of Christianity in late antiquity, the Eastern Mediterranean had been the heartland of the Christian Church. However, in the middle of the 7th century, the Levant, parts of Asia Minor, and west into North Africa had all been conquered by the Arabs, and people there converted to Islam for the most part in the 7th and 8th centuries. The Arabs, Muslims, had been relatively tolerant of Christian pilgrims visiting Jerusalem over the centuries, but the Turks, who conquered large parts of the region in the 11th century, were less so. It was in response to the expansion of Turkish power. In the second half of the 11th century that the First Crusade was preached by Pope Urban II in Western Europe in 1095. Tens of thousands took the cross and headed east. Between 1097 and 1099, they succeeded in conquering most of the Levant, finally entering Jerusalem in July 1099. With this, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa were set up in the Holy Land as Christian Crusader states. The most senior of these were the rulers of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The first of these was Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the leaders of the First Crusade, who was subsequently acclaimed as King Godfrey the Friend of Jerusalem after the capture of the Holy City in 1099. The Crusader region was referred to back in Western Christendom over the next 2 centuries as Outre-mer, meaning overseas, though many historians today refer to the region in the 12th and 13th centuries as either the Crusader states or the Latin East, or even as the Frankish kingdoms, in recognition that many of the main Crusader lords came from what had been the Kingdom of the Franks back in Western Europe. Indeed, the Muslims of the Levant came to refer to them collectively as the Franks. In the early 12th century, the Crusader states began to emerge as settled polities, with Italian merchants operating out of ports such as Acre and connecting it with Western Christendom. Several orders of religious knights, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers, emerged as powerful orders of holy warriors, but the Muslim response was also quick in coming. Muslim lords such as Imad al-Din, better known as Zengi, And Nur ad-Din, operating out of Syria, Egypt, and northern Mesopotamia, began battling extensively with the Crusader states from the 1120s onwards. In 1144, the city of Edessa fell to the Muslims, leading to a new crusade being preached back in Europe. The Second Crusade had been more extensive than the First Crusade, bringing both King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany to the Holy Land with tens of thousands of warriors. It was a sign of the stiff resistance which the Christians now faced in the Levant that this Second Crusade was far less successful than the first, with little new land brought under the control of the Crusader states. Though after the Second Crusade, in 1153, King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, young Baldwin's uncle, had succeeded in seizing Ascalon, one of the few urban centers in the Levant which the Fatimid rulers of Egypt had managed to retain control of since the First Crusade. But when his brother Baldwin's father, Almaric, succeeded him in 1163, after Baldwin III died childless, he would face a major threat in the shape of Nur ad-Din. This was the context in which Baldwin IV's life and reign would play out. Before exploring the life of Baldwin, it is worth pausing to briefly consider the nature of the historical sources which are available for the Crusader states at this time. In general, the High Middle Ages are a period for which there is nothing like the abundant amount of bureaucratic, governmental, and judicial records which survive for more modern times, or even extensive correspondence. This is doubly the case for the Crusader states of the Holy Land, where what records were produced in the 12th century were generally lost and destroyed as the Crusader states collapsed in the course of the 13th century. Owing to this, we are especially reliant on a number of chronicles written by contemporary historians. Two of these were written by figures that were present in Outremer during Baldwin's times, and who were eyewitnesses to much of the events they describe. The Chronicle of William of Tyre, the Archbishop of Tyre between 1175 and his death in 1186, is especially valuable as William was a tutor to Baldwin in his youth, played a role in diagnosing the future king with leprosy in his childhood years, and was central to the history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem throughout Baldwin's reign. Another valuable contemporary source is the Chronicle of Ernul and Bernard the Treasurer. This was written by Ernul, a squire of Balian of Ibelin, a Crusader lord of the 1170s and 1180s. Ernul's chronicle provides a history of the Crusader states from 1100 to 1228, and is a valuable source for Baldwin's life from an individual who was a teenager there in the early 1180s. While these are the two most important sources for Baldwin's life, there are others which provide some ancillary details, notably a number of Latin chronicles written by figures in Western Europe who related the news that arrived in England, France, and other regions from the Holy Land during Baldwin's reign. The Libellus de Expugnatione Terrae Sanctae per Saladinum, meaning roughly the Book of the Conquest of the Holy Land by Saladin, was written by an anonymous knight who was present in the Holy Land in the 1180s and provides some important details on developments there in the mid-1180s around the time of Baldwin's death. There are also numerous Arabic and Byzantine chronicles and histories of the late 12th and 13th centuries that shed light on Baldwin's reign. As such, there are a good number of different sources available for Baldwin's life, but inevitably, there are still considerable limitations to what we can decipher about a monarch who lived over 800 years ago. From the sources we have, we know a good deal about how Baldwin was brought up and educated. He would have spent much of his early life in Jerusalem, rarely venturing beyond the city in a land where the Christians held the towns and cities, but where the countryside was prone to attacks by Muslim bands. In Jerusalem, Baldwin would have grown up at a court which had more of a military feel than even those back in medieval Europe, one in which every ruler knew beyond a doubt that his primary role was to defend his state against Muslim incursions and to try to reclaim further territories for the church, a land where even monks wore armor and carried weapons. In 1170, William of Tyre, the man who would later write a chronicle of Baldwin's reign, returned from the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, where Amalric had dispatched him on a diplomatic mission. When he reached Jerusalem, the king appointed him as tutor to his son, as William, who by then was an archdeacon, was widely recognized as one of the most learned figures in Outremer. The dual nature of the Christian Crusader states as polities, in which Christians and Muslims often lived side by side, was seen in Baldwin's education in other spheres. It was an Arab by the name of Abul Khair who taught Baldwin to ride a horse. Baldwin's Early years and education were highly significant in other respects. He was sent to live for lengthy periods of time in the household of William of Tyre, and it was while he was there that William first noticed the symptoms of Baldwin's leprosy. In later years, he recounted his discovery in the following way. While he was staying with me, it happened that, as he was playing with some boys of noble birth who were with him, they were pinching each other on the arms and hands with their nails, as children often do when playing together. The others cried out when they were hurt, whereas he bore it all with great patience, like one who is used to pain, although his friends did not spare him in any way. When this had happened several times, and I was told about it, I thought it was a consequence of his patient disposition, not of his insensitivity to pain. Calling him to me, I began to ask him questions about it. Finally, I came to realize that half of his right arm and hand was dead, so that he could not feel the pinchings at all, or even feel if he was bitten. Then I began to feel uncertain in my mind, recalling the words of the wise man who said, "It is a certainty that a limb which is without feeling is not conducive to health, and that a sick man who does not feel himself to be so incurs great danger." His father was told, and after the doctors had been consulted, careful attempts were made to help him with poultices, ointments, and even charms, but all in vain. For with the passage of time, we came to understand more clearly that this marked the beginning of a more serious and totally incurable disease. It grieves me greatly to say this, but when he became an adolescent, he was seen to be suffering from leprosy to a dangerous degree. Another sign of the cultural tolerance which existed in the Crusader states at this time was seen in the hiring of Arab doctors to treat Baldwin, chief amongst them Abu Sulayman Dawood. But there was no cure for Baldwin's leprosy, or even an effective treatment. His leprosy would come to define his life in many ways, as will become clear. The disease that his son and heir were suffering from was not King Amalric's only concern. He had begun his reign by taking the offensive against the Muslims that bordered on the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The main power at this time was the Fatimid Caliphate, which ruled Egypt and adjoining lands, a power which had been in decline for some time, in part because of the expansion of the Turkic Muslim powers further to the north, who had controlled the Levant prior to the arrival of the First Crusade. The Fatimids experienced a period of intense internal instability and famine throughout the 1160s, and Amalric was able to campaign effectively against them in the first year of his reign, consolidating the southern frontier of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But matters were very different to the north. In the early autumn of 1164, news arrived in Jerusalem that Nur ad-Din, the Turkic Muslim ruler of Syria, had defeated a Crusader force of the county of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch at the Battle of Harim, obliterating or capturing thousands of Crusader knights and soldiers. This was a costly defeat which the Crusader states could ill afford at a time when reinforcement from Western Europe was the only way of making up for such losses on the battlefield. Defeat at Harim put the Crusaders on the defensive for several years to come. It was at this juncture that Amalric entered negotiations with the Byzantines that resulted in him marrying Maria Comnene in order to acquire military aid from the Greeks. It was several years after the disaster at Harim when Amalric learned of his son's condition. It was most likely kept secret to begin with, and there may even have been some doubt as to whether the diagnosis was correct. Baldwin did not appear to have any visible physical symptoms of leprosy during his youth, and the diagnosis was made purely on the basis of his lack of nerve sensation. The royal family would also have been reluctant to publicize the illness of the king's son. Leprosy carried an enormous social stigma at the time, the belief being that the disease was something of an affliction visited on individuals by God for some perceived wrongdoing. Consider the following passage on leprosy from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted." Scholars have speculated that the Christians of the Crusader states were more tolerant of leprosy than their brethren back in Western Europe, and indeed in the 1140s, the Order of St. Lazarus had been established in Jerusalem for the care of lepers. However, there was still no doubt that Baldwin's condition would be enormously problematic, not least because lepers were largely expected to segregate themselves away from wider society, the belief in the contagious nature of leprosy being strong. Hansen's disease, to give it its modern clinical name, is contagious, but it requires prolonged exposure to the bodily fluids of those who carry it for someone to be infected. This was not known in pre-modern times, however. The expectation that someone like Baldwin should shut himself away under the care of the Lazar house in Jerusalem was impractical for a king-in-waiting whose primary duty was to lead armies, something which would become nigh on impossible as his condition deteriorated in years to come, but which Baldwin would still rise to the challenge of doing. Amalric was aware of all of this and was concerned about the succession. As a result, this may have informed his decision to remarry in 1167, but he would find no solution before his own premature death, the latest in a long line of kings of Jerusalem to die young. In 1174, after the death of Nur ad-Din, the Great, nemesis of his reign, Amalric laid siege to the town of Banias. Eventually, he had to give up on this, realizing that the town was not worth the resources that would have been required to maintain a long siege. It was while heading back to Jerusalem from Banias that he fell ill with dysentery. Though easily treatable in an age of antibiotics, medicines, and clean water, dysentery was often fatal in pre-modern times, and so it proved to be in Amalric's case. His condition deteriorated in the days that followed, and back in Jerusalem, he began running a severe fever. Despite being attended by a range of Latin, Greek, and Arab doctors in the days that followed, nothing effective could be done, and Amalric died on the 11th of July 1174, at just 38 years of age. With that, Baldwin, who was approximately 13 years old at the time, succeeded as King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. Owing to his youth, a regency government would control affairs until he reached his majority, which was deemed to be at age 15. Initially, Miles of Plancy, the seneschal of Jerusalem, a senior magistrate in the city, assumed the position of regent. However, within a few weeks, Raymond, Count of Tripoli, one of the senior-most nobles of Outremer, arrived in Jerusalem and declared his intention to rule as regent during Baldwin's minority. The 2 years of Baldwin's minority rule were important in framing the circumstances in which Baldwin would reign in his own right from 1176 onwards. The death of Nur ad-Din had left something of a political vacuum in Syria. It was quickly filled by a noted warrior of a scholarly disposition who had emerged in the 1160s under Nur ad-Din's wing. This was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a warlord who hailed from Tikrit in what is now Iraq. He is better known by the Arabic laqab or epithet which he acquired in later life, Salah ad-Din or Saladin, meaning the righteousness of the faith. In the mid-1160s, Saladin had gone to Egypt with Nur ad-Din's blessing to shore up the Muslim position there, as the Fatimid Caliphate was in crisis. In 1171, following the death of the last Fatimid Caliph, Saladin effectively brought the Egyptian Caliphate to an end and realigned it with the Islamic Caliphate in Baghdad. Then, in the mid-1170s, following Nur ad-Din's death, he seized power to a large extent in Syria as well. What this meant was that the Crusader states, and Baldwin as the chief ruler amongst them, now faced a skilled Muslim warlord who could strike at Outremer from both the north out of Syria and the south out of Egypt, while also controlling much of the Arabian Peninsula. In Jerusalem, even as a teenager, Baldwin knew that the threat posed by Saladin and the Ayyubids was a major issue that would have implications for his reign. Our sources make it fairly clear that from early on in his reign, he was considering the succession already, and his role as ruler of Jerusalem. His leprosy precluded the possibility of marriage and of siring children of his own. He did not have a brother to whom the throne might easily descend, but unlike some Christian kingdoms back in the Latin West, women were not precluded from the succession in Outremer. Indeed, Baldwin's grandmother, Melisende, had ruled as Queen of Jerusalem either on her own or as a co-ruler for much of the period between the death of her father, King Baldwin II, in 1131, and when her own son, Baldwin III, began to rule in his own stead in the 1150s. As a result, it was clear to many in Jerusalem that Baldwin IV's sister, Sibylla, offered a clear line of succession within the kingdom. This was further cemented in the mid-1170s when Sibylla married William of Montferrat, known by the epithet Longsword, an indication of his military prowess. It seems that Baldwin may have been preparing to abdicate in favor of William and Sibylla when William was well enough prepared for the role. However, his plan was quickly scuppered. William died in 1177, most likely from malaria, though not before Sibylla fell pregnant with a son who would subsequently be christened Baldwin, after his uncle, the king. in response to the death of William. In 1177, Baldwin moved to appoint Reynold of Châtillon as the new regent. As a king who could not campaign for sustained periods of time against Saladin and other Muslim warlords, Baldwin needed someone who could do so on his behalf, especially in regions far from Jerusalem. Reynold was an ideal candidate. He was born in France and had only arrived in Outremer in the late 1140s as part of the Second Crusade, becoming a substantial force for a time in the Principality of Antioch during the 1150s. But in more recent years, he had established himself as the most aggressive of the Crusader nobles, though a ruthless one who launched raids on Cyprus and the Byzantine Empire in an effort to aggrandize himself at the expense of his neighbors, be they Christian or Muslim. Around the time of Baldwin's birth in the early 1160s, Reynold had been captured by the Muslims of Syria and had spent many years in captivity. However, in 1176, he was released on payment of a large ransom. With this, he established himself as the Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, a principality to the southeast of the Dead Sea in what is now Jordan, by marrying the lady of the territory, Stephanie of Milly. There, Reynold quickly developed a reputation for his aggressive attacks on the Ayyubid trade and caravan routes between Egypt and their wider territories in Syria and Mesopotamia, sundering connections between the two parts of Saladin's growing sphere of control. Having proved himself in this capacity, Baldwin and his advisors determined that Reynold was the best individual to appoint as regent and military commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177. This decision was owing to Baldwin's deteriorating health, as he had seemingly become ill from whatever had killed William Longsword around the same time. Reynold soon distinguished himself in one of the most significant military encounters between the Christian Crusaders and the Muslim lords of the Levant and Egypt during the 12th century, the Battle of Montgisard. Baldwin was involved in this as well. The clash took place against Baldwin's diplomatic efforts to form a new alliance with the Byzantine Empire, Manuel IV Komnenos, with the aim of launching a fresh expedition into Egypt. Baldwin's efforts were seemingly aided by the arrival of Philip, Count of Flanders in the Low Countries, to the Holy Land in August 1177, with extensive resources. Philip landed at the port of Acre and immediately sent word to Baldwin, who was Philip's cousin. Baldwin viewed Philip's arrival as a potential mechanism to allow him to withdraw from the kingship, offering Philip the regency. However, Philip refused and also balked at the idea of campaigning into Egypt. Instead, he headed to Tripoli, with his forces to join up with Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, for an attack on the city of Harim in Saladin's territory in Syria. Alerted to the movement of hundreds of Crusader knights and auxiliary forces towards Harim, Saladin decided to strike into the Kingdom of Jerusalem, while the Crusader resources were deployed far to the north. Though his illness generally precluded Baldwin from sustained military campaigning himself, in the military emergency that now developed, he had no option but to oversee the gathering of what resources and men could be mustered, and to lead the defense of Jerusalem and the surrounding region against Saladin's incursion in November 1177. The figures for such military engagements are notoriously unreliable. The Christian chronicles, for instance, suggest that Saladin led a host of upwards of 25,000 men into the kingdom that early winter, which was surely an exaggeration. However, the idea that Baldwin and Reynold only had a few hundred knights and several thousand auxiliary soldiers to defend the kingdom was probably more accurate. His initial goal was to protect the city of Ascalon, but after learning of Saladin's attacks on numerous Christian settlements further inland, Baldwin moved eastwards away from the coastal region. His and Saladin's forces would eventually meet on the 25th of November, 1177. The exact location of the Battle of Montgisard is unclear, though scholars agree it took place somewhere in the Ramla region, lying to the south of what is now Tel Aviv-Yaffo and northeast of Ashdod. Here, Baldwin's forces needed victory in order to prevent Saladin from capturing extensive territory or potentially even marching on Jerusalem itself. The arrival of Baldwin and his men around Montgisard took Saladin by surprise. He had not expected the Crusaders to leave the safety of Ascalon and other cities, while so much of their forces were far away to the north in Syria. Thus, on the 25th, at the Battle of Montgisard, Baldwin and Reynold caught Saladin's forces by surprise. Not all of his army was arranged here, and Saladin had dispersed some of his units to scour the surrounding countryside. Hence, the Muslim commander was taken by surprise and cut off with only some of his men when the Crusaders charged at them near Montgisard. Raynald and Baldwin, the latter of whom, despite his leprosy, was known to have been a skillful horse rider in his youth, led a cavalry charge straight towards the center of Saladin's lines with his heavy cavalry. The result was a complete rout, as Saladin tried to form up his battle lines properly and then ordered a retreat. This maneuver became chaotic, and as Raynald's and Baldwin's units chased after the Muslim forces, many of Saladin's men, his great-nephew included, were cut down. The slaughter was compounded by the fall of darkness, which made the retreat even more disjointed. Then, to compound matters, in the 2 days that followed, Baldwin, Raynald, and their men were able to identify pockets of Saladin's men in the surrounding countryside, cutting them off and taking many prisoners. The Battle of Montgisard was a consummate victory for the Crusader cause, one which ensured the safety of Jerusalem for several years to come as Saladin regrouped. Despite his physical limitations, Baldwin had won a major victory. The victory at Montgisard was a galvanizing episode for Baldwin, one which shored up support for the monarchy in Jerusalem after years of intrigue surrounding the king, whose leprosy was viewed as a sign of God's ill judgment. Now others thought differently. Rumors spread of St. George having been seen on the field of battle near Baldwin during the clash. To commemorate the victory and make the most of it from a propaganda perspective, it was determined that a Benedictine monastery would be erected at the site of the clash in honor of St. Catherine, on whose feast day the battle had occurred. Meanwhile, to the north in Syria, Philip of Flanders and the other Crusader lords there reached an agreement whereby they would abandon the siege of Harim in return for the ceding of some minor lands and villages to the Crusader states from the Muslims. With that, Philip left to return to Europe, bringing to an end his own personal crusade. In Jerusalem, Baldwin began to associate himself more closely in the late 1170s with his sister, making it clear that if he was to die soon without a clear successor, having emerged, Sibylla would rule on behalf of her infant son, who had just been born and christened Baldwin in honor of the king. This was not a case of joint rule at this juncture, though as his health declined further in the years to come, it would become something akin to this. In the main, he was able to begin stamping his authority to a greater extent in the aftermath of Montgisard as he entered into his adult years. Under Baldwin, Jerusalem continued as a city of religious toleration, to a fair degree, with the young king inclined, much like both his father and uncle had been as kings of Jerusalem, to allow Muslims access to the city, the third holiest in Islam after Mecca and Medina, and to form a relatively cosmopolitan polity in line with his upbringing, with some Arab tutors and doctors. Baldwin, his father Amalric, and his brother Baldwin III were at heart largely scholar kings with an interest in the law and literature, rather than being strictly warrior kings. Consequently, as limited in length as Baldwin's reign would be, there was a cerebral quality to it above and beyond the near-incessant clashes between Muslim and Christian across Outre-mer. With his newfound role as a substantial leader in the aftermath of Montgisard, Baldwin became a more regular war leader in the years that followed, but it proved nearly impossible to recreate the success of the early winter of 1177. While the Battle of Montgisard had ended in victory, it had also cost the Crusaders men. In a region where reinforcements nearly always had to arrive from the faraway Latin West, this backup was slow in coming. Broad-based crusades were only ever preached in response to disasters in the Levant, such as the loss of Edessa, which instigated the Second Crusade in the mid-1140s. Successes like Montgisard did not. Instead, when matters were going well for the Christian cause in the Levant, the rulers of Western Europe ignored it and continued their own petty squabbles back in France, England, and Germany. Thus, Baldwin's armies were reduced in size at the end of the 1170s. Saladin, who could acquire many reinforcements when he needed them, realized this and so quickly recovered from the defeat at Montgisard. In 1179, he launched a new military incursion against the Crusader states. This was in response to a raid that Baldwin led into Syria that spring. These movements culminated on the 10th of June 1179 in the Battle of Marj Ayyun near Sidon. Here, Baldwin and his allies, including the Master of the Knights Templar and Raymond of Tripoli, succeeded in defeating an initial Muslim force. However, in the aftermath, Saladin's main force arrived and inflicted a serious defeat on the Christians. The defeat at the Battle of Marj Ayyun was nearly fatal for Baldwin. In the midst of it, he was unhorsed, and while he was still able to ride at this juncture, He could not remount his horse unaided. In the end, the king had to be rushed from the battlefield, being carried on the back of a Crusader knight, while his personal bodyguard fought their way out of the Muslim forces that had surrounded Baldwin and his entourage. Hence, the King of Jerusalem barely escaped with his life from the battlefield. Others were less fortunate. Many Christian knights and soldiers were killed or taken prisoner. Amongst the prisoners was Odo of St. Amand, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He would die in captivity the following year. Count Raymond of Tripoli only barely escaped from the fighting. Overall, the Battle of Marj Ayoun was a disaster for the Crusader cause, reversing the victory a year and a half earlier at Montgisard, where Baldwin had hoped to follow up that initial success by expanding his domain. In the aftermath of Marj Ayoun, as the 1180s dawned, the Crusaders were now on the back foot, with a dwindling amount of military resources, and were forced to adopt a defensive posture. Saladin, by way of contrast, was buoyant. After the Battle of Marj Ayoun, he immediately moved to strike at the castle of Chastelet. Baldwin had ordered the construction of this structure the previous year, overlooking Jacob's Ford, one of the larger fords of the upper course of the Jordan River. The castle was virtually complete by the summer of 1179, and now formed an important Crusader stronghold on the main route between the Galilee region eastwards through the Golan Heights and into Syria. Unhappy with the new Christian construction, Saladin decided to destroy it just weeks after Marj Ayoun, having previously attempted to bribe Baldwin into ceasing construction at Jacob's Ford. When that failed, and with Baldwin and the other Crusader lords reeling from the defeat at Marj Ayoun, he initiated a siege on the 23rd of August, which lasted for just over a week before a tunnel was successfully dug under the walls and a fire lit, collapsing the walls through a siege method known as sapping. With this, the Muslims burst into the fortress, killing many of the Crusaders and taking several hundred prisoners in another major defeat for Baldwin. The castle was left abandoned, with the walls semi-collapsed, though some of their ruins are still visible today, 8.5 centuries later. The victory was also not without cost for Saladin, as an outbreak of disease occurred amongst his men after seizing Chastelet and claimed many Muslim soldiers. Back in Jerusalem, as the full scale of the military reverse which had occurred in the summer of 1179 became clear, political measures were taken to try to acquire greater support from the Latin West for the Crusader cause in the East and to shore up the government in Jerusalem itself. At the heart of this were the royal family and a newcomer to the Holy Land, Guy of Lusignan. Guy was a French knight who arrived in the Levant at some juncture in the second half of the 1170s. The exact time of his appearance remains a matter of debate, but he was clearly in Jerusalem by 1179 when the disastrous Christian defeats at Marj Ayoun and Jacob's Ford occurred, or shortly thereafter. In the months that followed, he and his supporters gained the ear of Baldwin's mother, Agnes, and she was soon promoting the idea that her daughter, Baldwin's sister, Sibylla, a widow since the death of William Longsword in 1177, should marry Guy. These developments came to a head in Easter week of 1180, when a marriage alliance between Guy and Sibylla was formed with Baldwin's blessing. William of Tyre informs us that the reason for the marriage alliance was in order to gain Guy's aid in forestalling a plot by Count Raymond of Tripoli and Prince Bohemond of Antioch to overthrow Baldwin, though William himself was absent from Jerusalem at this time and was not an eyewitness to these events. Whatever the truth of it may have been, the result is reasonably clear. Guy married Sibylla, bringing fresh support to Baldwin's kingship in the shape of the Lusignan faction that shored up the king's position in the aftermath of the defeats of 1179. It was not just Guy and the supporters of Lusignan that Baldwin was seeking to acquire aid from in 1180. In the immediate aftermath of the marriage, Baldwin dispatched one of his closest advisors and ministers, and a near relative on his mother's side, Jocelyn of Courtenay, to Constantinople. The goal was to allay the concerns which the emperor there may have had about the diplomatic reorientation in Jerusalem, and to appeal for fresh aid from the Byzantines. However, at Constantinople, Jocelyn's mission stalled as Emperor Manuel III died there in September 1180 and was succeeded by his 11-year-old son, Alexios II, initiating a regency government which was in little position to offer immediate aid to the Crusader states. Envoys to Western Europe were dispatched through the Knights Templar, which had become a powerful institution in Western Christendom by that time. They initially held out the hope of a major new crusade in response to the defeats in the Levant of 1179. Pope Alexander III responded by sending out missives to many monarchs and lords in Europe, notably King Philip II of France and King Henry II of England. These would fall on deaf ears for the most part, though it is noteworthy that Alexander's petitions included a searing attack on Baldwin, claiming that Saladin's victories in 1179 at Marj Ayoun and Jacob's Ford were the result of Baldwin's leprosy, which in turn was portrayed as a symptom of God's judgment of the sins of the Crusaders. It is typically assumed that it was this papal condemnation of Baldwin's illness that inspired William of Tyre to begin writing his chronicle as a defense of Baldwin, his former pupil. While little material support was forthcoming from the West to the Christians of the Levant in the early 1180s, circumstances were nevertheless improving for Baldwin and the Crusader lords during these years. A reconciliation of a kind was reached between Baldwin and Guy of Lusignan on the one hand, and Raymond of Tripoli on the other, the latter of whom had aspired to seize the throne of Jerusalem for a time. With this rapprochement, the Crusaders assembled their forces and were able to meet Saladin's armies again in the field at La Fortelée in the south of the Galilee region in July of 1182. At this battle, where Baldwin was again present in person to command the Crusader forces, the Christians won a notable victory, the first sign of changing fortunes since the series of defeats in the summer of 1179. Saladin made a further effort to strike that summer against Beirut, but Baldwin, Guy, and Raymond, assisted by a small contingent of reinforcements from Germany and Italy, led by Duke Henry of Lotharingia and financed by the merchants of the port city of Pisa in Italy, were able to fend off the attack. Thereafter, Reynaud of Châtillon recommenced the attacks he had engaged in several years earlier against the Arab caravan routes passing through Jordan and the Sinai Peninsula. He even managed to launch 5 Crusader warships on the Red Sea near the Gulf of Aqaba, a feat never before accomplished by the Crusaders. These attacks on Muslim shipping ranged from Yemen northwards to Saladin's other territories. In 1183, a Christian force even penetrated Arabia to within a day's march of Medina. Thus, while 1179 had seen major reverses for the Crusader states, and while Pope Alexander might have criticized Baldwin to the rest of Christendom in 1181, the 2 years that followed saw a resurgence of Christian power in the Middle East. While 1182 and 1183 had seen some successes, Baldwin's own personal circumstances were not good. His health had begun to decline precipitously in the early 1180s. By 1182, his leprosy had degenerated to the point where he was largely blind and crippled. He could barely use his hands or feet unaided. William of Tyre presents the following description of the degeneration of Baldwin's health. Day by day, his condition became worse. The extremities and face were especially attacked, so that his faithful followers were moved with compassion when they looked at him. In addition, the leprosy which had begun to trouble him at the beginning of his reign, in fact, in very early youth, became much worse than usual. His sight failed, and his extremities were covered with ulcerations, so that he was unable to use either his hands or his feet. Yet up to this time, he had declined to heed the suggestion offered by some that he lay aside his kingly dignity and give up the administration of the realm. Despite these ailments, there was resilience to Baldwin. A good horse rider in his youth, when he lost the ability to ride at the front of his armies, he insisted on still campaigning, being carried on a litter. In Jerusalem, he attended councils of state even when ill. These councils often focused on the problems of continuing to finance the military campaigns, and in February 1183, Baldwin was forced to impose a tax known as the Curia Generalis, a general levy of 1% of the value of property and 2% of all incomes. There is no evidence to suggest that Baldwin would have attended these council meetings wearing a mask of any kind, as some popular modern depictions of him have suggested. Instead, his advisors, the Crusader lords, and the heads of the religious orders would have seen directly the deteriorating physical state of their king. His face, a growing mass of scabs and necrotic scars. Most would have known that he did not have long left in the world. By 1184, Baldwin's situation had declined to the extent that he effectively established his nephew, Sibylla's son Baldwin, from her first marriage to the deceased William of Montferrat, as his official co-ruler. Clearly, the young Baldwin, who was only 6 years of age, did not perform this role in any capacity himself, but what it did mean was that power was being shared to an even greater extent with Sibylla and her second husband, Guy of Lusignan. This arrangement was fractious. Guy was a heavy-handed figure, one who increasingly treated the severely ill king with disdain, refusing to grant him the city of Tyre, part of Guy's territory, when Baldwin offered to leave Guy in charge of Jerusalem. In exchange, the king wished to reside at Tyre on the coast in his final days, where proximity to the Mediterranean seemed to aid his condition, perhaps the additional moisture in the air relieving the torment to his skin. Further agitation followed when Guy's actions nearly led to the loss of Kerak Castle in Jordan, while in 1184, Guy massacred a contingent of Bedouin in the Negev region who had previously allied with the Crusaders, actions which Baldwin strongly condemned. There was one last effort made by Baldwin to secure aid from the Latin West, though, unbeknownst to Guy and others in Outremer, the mission was also launched with orders from Baldwin to consult with the Christian lords back in Western Europe on the succession to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Ideally, Baldwin was seeking a Western prince who would come to the Levant and rule in association with him, allowing him to live his last years in peace, while also circumventing the perennially feuding Crusader lords, such as his brother-in-law, Guy of Lusignan, Reynald of Châtillon, and Count Raymond of Tripoli. The mission was led by Heraclius, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem and Archbishop of Caesarea, the leading Christian religious figure in the Levant. In 1184, he was dispatched across the Mediterranean along with Roger de Moulins, the Grand Master of one of the major religious orders, the Knights Hospitallers, and the new Grand Master of the Templars, Arnold of Toraja. The trio took with them several relics and the keys of both the gates of Jerusalem and the doors of the Holy Sepulchre, the most holy church in the Levant in the Christian quarter of Jerusalem. In Europe, Heraclius visited Italy, France, and England. Like many such envoys before and afterwards, he received grand promises from the monarchs and lords of Western Christendom about their intentions to head on crusade to Outremer, but they all proved lackluster. In 1185, he returned to Jerusalem with a promise from Henry II of England that he would soon follow with an army to reinforce Baldwin's position, but it never materialized. By the time Heraclius returned to Outremer, the king who had sent him to Western Europe was dead. Baldwin's rapid deterioration over the past years came to a head in 1185. He died at some unknown date in the spring of that year, a few weeks short of his 24th birthday, and certainly before the 16th of May, at which time his nephew was referred to as the sole king of Jerusalem. Sicardus of Cremona, a contemporary Italian religious authority and historian who later ended up in the Levant himself as part of the Fourth Crusade, and who was involved in efforts to organize a new crusade in the 1180s, around the time Baldwin died, lauded Baldwin in an encomiastic passage in one of his writings, declaring that although he had suffered greatly from leprosy from a young age, he had won a notable victory over Saladin at Montgisard in 1177 and had preserved the Crusader states. During his reign, Baldwin was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem at the foot of Mount Calvary, near his father King Amalric's tomb, and those of the other Latin kings who had ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem since the First Crusade. With Baldwin's passing, his nephew succeeded as King Baldwin V of Jerusalem, a child nearing just 8 years old. He was unable to rule in his own right, and a minority government headed by Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, was set up to govern the Kingdom of Jerusalem until he came of age. That would never happen. He was dead himself a year later, the child dying under murky circumstances in the early autumn of 1186, though many historians dispute the inference of the chroniclers that Raymond had his charge poisoned in order to become king himself. In any event, it was not Raymond who claimed the throne after Baldwin IV's premature death, but instead Sibylla and her husband, Guy of Lusignan, stepped into the breach. The accession of Guy as King of Jerusalem in 1186 virtually guaranteed renewed war with the Muslims and Saladin, and so it proved. Clashes broke out in late 1186 and continued into 1187. These culminated in July that year in the Battle of Hattin to the west of the Sea of Galilee. In this, Saladin won a major victory, and Guy was captured along with Reynald of Châtillon, who had caused Saladin such problems with the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria for the better part of a decade. While Guy was kept prisoner, Saladin had Reynald beheaded, proclaiming him to be nothing more than a bandit. With victory at Hattin and Guy imprisoned in Damascus, Saladin now marched on Jerusalem, and, after a short siege of 2 weeks in late September and early October, the city fell to the Muslims after less than a century under Christian Crusader control. With this calamitous development, the call went out to Western Europe for a new crusade. The Third Crusade is arguably the most famous of them all, an engagement which pitted Richard the Lionheart, the King of England and lord of extensive territories in France, against Saladin for several years in the early 1190s. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, was also involved, leading many to refer to the Third Crusade as the King's Crusade. However, despite the fact that it drew both Barbarossa and Richard the Lionheart to participate, the Third Crusade failed in its ultimate objective of recapturing Jerusalem for the Christians, though the Holy City was reclaimed 40 years later. During the Sixth Crusade in 1229, this was only a brief hiatus. Ultimately, the Crusader cause was flagging by then as the monarchs and lords of Europe continued to show a greater interest in fighting each other than the Muslims of the Levant, while resources were also directed towards failed expeditions to North Africa. Beginning in the 1250s, the Crusader states lost growing amounts of territory to new Muslim lords, concluding in 1291 with the fall of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. The Crusader states came to an end 2 centuries after they were first established. Baldwin IV's reign as King of Jerusalem was highly complex. He succeeded as the ruler of the kingdom when he was barely a teenager, and with the added complication of suffering from leprosy. It was clear from early on that he would never produce an heir, and so a succession crisis always overshadowed his time as King of Jerusalem. But despite these limitations, his time as king was successful in some respects. In particular, the Crusader victory at the Battle of Montgisard stalled the Muslim advance against the Crusaders in the 1170s, as did some further military successes. In the years that followed, Baldwin earned the respect of his contemporaries for overseeing these efforts, but there was never any doubt that his reign was going to be a brief one. In the end, he died at just 23 years of age. When he did, a fresh series of crises struck the Crusader states in quick succession, notably the death of Baldwin IV, the defeat at Hattin, the imprisonment of King Guy by Saladin, and the loss of Jerusalem. It was only with the fall of Jerusalem that Western Christendom awoke to the scale of the threat posed by Saladin in the Levant. Had they provided aid and launched a Third Crusade earlier during Baldwin's reign, one wonders whether Jerusalem would have fallen and how the history of the Crusader states might have been different. What do you think of these remarkable medieval monarchs? Do you believe Baldwin's courage in the face of his terrible illness made him one of history's most inspiring kings? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Sweet dreams await in part 2, where we'll continue our gentle journey through the age of chivalry.